Ever found yourself, like, absolutely needing that last cookie, even when you know you're totally stuffed?
Mhm.
Or maybe looked into your dog's eyes and wondered, is that tail wag pure, unadulterated joy?
Yeah, those everyday moments, they really brush up against something huge, don't they? What
Mhm.
actually drives our emotions? What fuels our desires?
Exactly. It's this incredibly complex topic.
It really is. And, the inner landscape of our feelings and motivations, well, it's puzzled thinkers for ages. So today we're taking a deep dive into some of the cutting-edge research.
Right, from psychology and neuroscience, looking at how our understanding of this whole landscape is kind of shifting.
Absolutely. And we've got some really fascinating material to get into. We'll be unpacking a big overview by Berridge. He traces how we've thought about emotion and motivation over time.
Okay.
Plus, we'll be looking closely at two pretty recent research articles, one from Massaccesi and colleagues, and another from Korb and their collaborators.
And they're looking at the brain chemistry, right? The
Ah,
chemicals behind how we chase rewards.
precisely. They shed light on the neurochemicals that power that pursuit.
So our mission today is basically to boil down these, well, pretty intricate findings into something clear, something compelling for you listening.
Yeah, we want to uncover some of the maybe surprising truths about what motivates us, how we experience feelings, sometimes in ways we're not even consciously aware of.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this then.
All right.
So I guess the first big question, and it feels like a real head scratcher, is what is an emotion? I mean, does it have to be a subjective feeling, something we're actually aware of feeling inside?
You'd think it's simple, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a major point of, well, debate in
Oh,
the
yeah.
field.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So on one side, you've got prominent researchers like Joseph Ledoux and Lisa Feldman Barrett. They argue that, a genuine emotion needs that personal internal experience.
Okay, the feeling itself.
Right. Ledoux, he really emphasizes that being able to talk about our feelings, Gerbil reports, that's the gold standard for knowing if an emotion is truly there.
Huh. So if you can't say it, you don't really feel it, in his view.
Pretty much. He even suggests that because animals and infants can't tell us how they feel, well, maybe they just have basic reactions, not like full-fledged emotions in the way we experience them.
Wow, okay, so that joyful giggle from a baby, maybe it's not the same kind of joy I feel when I hear good news. That really challenges how we usually think about it.
It does.
Yeah.
According to Ledoux's pretty strict view, yeah, that's the implication. And Barrett, she comes at it from a more cognitive angle.
How so?
Well, she suggests that our human concepts of emotion, which are complex, right, shaped by language, culture, they're actually essential for constructing an emotion in the moment.
So the thought almost creates the feeling.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
She famously questions, does a growling dog feel anger? And he kind of leans towards no,
Mm.
because dogs don't have those intricate human concepts of what anger is.
Okay, so the core idea there is maybe our feelings aren't just raw reactions. They need our thoughts, our language to even exist.
Exactly. It challenges that everyday understanding.
Mhm.
Are they our feelings if we can't even articulate them?
It's very thought-provoking. It sort of suggests our language or thoughts actually build our emotions.
Precisely. And that lines up with some older ideas, cognitive appraisal theories, the notion that our interpretations actively shape what we feel.
But then there's the other side, right? The view that emotions, or at least basic affective reactions, can happen without us even knowing, and maybe that's something to share with animals.
Absolutely. Yeah. Many contemporary ecologists, neuroscientists too, including people like Antonio Damasio, they believe these affective reactions and emotions can operate implicitly,
Implicitly, meaning,
meaning beneath conscious awareness. They can exist alongside our subjective feelings or even without them. Damasio argues that the basic brain circuits for subjectivity, for feeling anything really, have ancient evolutionary roots.
ancient, like how ancient?
We're talking hundreds of millions of years, located deep in the older parts of the brain. So he's saying the capacity for feeling isn't just a human thing, and it's definitely not new in evolutionary terms.
Okay, that makes sense. A very different perspective.
It is. And he also makes this really crucial distinction between the emotion itself, the physiological reaction maybe, and the feeling of that emotion. He points out we often use the same word for both, which causes loads of confusion.
Right, like fear could be the racing heart or the conscious feeling of being scared.
Exactly. And he believes they're quite distinct phenomena.
So where does Kent Berridge, whose review we're looking at, where does he land in all this?
Well, Berridge agrees it's really important to separate those internal subjective feelings from the objective, observable reactions. things we can measure.
Oh, okay.
But he really stresses that any claims about emotion, whether it's in humans or animals, they're just starting points, hypotheses. What really matters is the evidence we gather through, careful scientific study.
Rather than getting bogged down in definitions first.
Exactly. Don't get stuck on preconceived definitions. Let the evidence guide us.
Okay, so building on that, this idea that proving subjective experience is tricky. It makes you wonder how we even try to study emotions in animals, right? If we can't just ask them.
Precisely. And Ledoux, he rightly points out, we can't have the same certainty about what an animal or an infant feels as we do about our own experience. I mean, I know what I'm feeling.
Right.
But Berridge counters that by noting, well, we also lack absolute proof of your subjective experience or any other adult humans besides ourselves. Can I be 100% sure your feeling of joy is identical to mine?
That's Nagel's point, isn't it, the philosopher, about what it's like to be a bat idea, the inherent mystery of someone else's inner life.
Exactly that. And Ledoux accepts verbal reports from other humans, not because of absolute proof, but based on, our shared biology, our shared species characteristics. It's a reasonable assumption, empathy.
An agreement based on being similar?
Yeah, it's based on empathy, not strict scientific proof in the absolute sense. So Berridge argues that demanding this absolute certainty for animal emotions, while accepting human reports based on empathy, well, it's a bit of a double standard, isn't it?
Huh. That's a really sharp point. We do use that empathetic reasoning all the time with people.
We do. And as Berridge reminds us, drawing on the philosopher Karl Popper, science isn't really about achieving absolute proof most of the time. It's about reducing uncertainty.
Bit by bit.
Yeah, gradually. Through evidence, one experiment at a time, building support, ruling out alternatives. If we insisted on absolute certainty for everything, well, a lot of valuable scientific exploration would just grind to a halt.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we move beyond just relying on what people tell us they're feeling, what kind of evidence do we actually have for these unconscious emotions, these affective reactions happening under the radar?
Well, there's a growing body of research suggesting that perhaps counterintuitively, focusing too much on trying to put feelings into words can actually change them.
Right.
Or even make them dissipate.
Really? Trying to analyze how I feel might make the feeling go away.
It seems so. Studies by people like Wilson and Schooler and Dijksterhuis and others, they indicate that introspection, looking inward, isn't always the most accurate path to understanding our true emotional responses.
So overthinking our feelings can actually mess with them. That is counterintuitive.
Feel that way, yeah. And even more surprisingly, there's evidence that basic affective reactions, positive or negative, can be triggered unconsciously.
By what?
By subliminal stimuli, things we don't even consciously register seeing or hearing. Yet these reactions can still influence our behavior, our judgments,
Yeah.
all without us feeling anything in particular.
Okay, hold on. Subliminal messages affecting what we do. That sounds like something out of a spy movie or something.
Hey, it might seem that way, but there's actually robust research behind it. Zajanks's early work hinted at this, and then Berridge and Winckelmann and others provided really compelling evidence.
Like what kind of evidence?
Okay, so get this. In one study, they had thirsty participants, really thirsty, and they briefly flashed images of happy faces or angry faces on a screen so fast the participants didn't consciously see them. Subliminal.
Right, too fast to register.
Exactly. Afterwards, the participants didn't report any change in their mood. They didn't feel happier or angrier. But those who've been subliminally shown happy faces, they subsequently poured and drank significantly more of a fruit beverage offered to them. And they were willing to pay more for it, too, compared to those who saw neutral faces.
Whoa. Just from an unseen happy face.
Yep. And conversely, the subliminal angry faces had the opposite effect. They drank less, wanted to pay less.
That is wild. So our brains are like picking up on these emotional cues unconsciously, and that's changing our motivation, our wanting.
That's exactly what it looks like. And crucially, these unconscious effects only really showed up when the participants were already thirsty.
Ah, okay. So the internal state matters.
Hugely. It highlights the vital role of our internal state thirst, in this case, in modulating these unconscious affective reactions and how much impact they have on what Berridge calls incentive salience.
Incentive salience. That's the wanting part again.
Yeah, think of it as that, ooh, I really want that feeling that grabs your attention, makes a cue attractive. This whole idea fits with what are known as the Bindra-Totes rules, basically. The idea that our motivation arises from the interaction between what we perceive in the world and what our internal needs are at that moment.
So our bodies might be having these tiny emotional reactions that we're totally unaware of, and those reactions are attuned to what we actually need right then.
Precisely. And this also casts some doubt on relying only on language, on verbal reports, as the gold standard for emotion, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does.
I mean, as Berridge points out, it's conceivable that computers might soon get good enough at talking about emotions to pass an emotional Turing test. They could convince us they have feelings, even if they're just processing information without any subjective experience at all.
Right, like a chatbot saying, I feel sad today.
Exactly. And even in us humans, sometimes talking about our emotions can be more of a cognitive interpretation, maybe even a distortion, rather than a pure reflection of our underlying state.
It really sounds like we need to look beyond just asking people how they feel if we want the full picture of emotion, which I suppose brings us back to the value of studying animals.
Absolutely.
Mm.
By observing animals, we can objectively map out the patterns, how their emotional and motivational processes work through their actions, their behaviors, even if we can't tap into their subjective experience directly.
So it's like studying the blueprint, the mechanism, without needing to know how it feels to be the machine.
Kind of, yeah. The goal is to develop a schematic understanding, focusing on how these processes operate. Like study how a car engine works, you don't need to know the engine feels hot to understand the mechanics, right?
Okay, so what does this schematic approach, looking at animal behavior, what does it reveal about emotion?
Well, researchers like Mason and Capitanio talk about component schemas. These are like hypothetical units in the brain that process specific kinds of information and are linked to observable behaviors, often with an emotional flavor.
Okay.
And Frieda and Parrott propose this idea of emotions in animals, sort of basic, objectively detectable psychological processes. They combine appraisals of the situation, an affective attitude like positive or negative, and a readiness to act in a certain way.
So trying to find the fundamental building blocks.
Exactly. The aim is to find common ground, continuity between these fundamental affective mechanisms in animals and the ones operating in us.
And it seems like one of the biggest discoveries to come out of animal studies is this distinction between wanting and liking. Can you break that down? Why is that such a big deal?
Oh, it's huge. This distinction, which was actually quite a surprise initially to researchers like Berridge, it's really become a cornerstone for how we understand reward now.
A surprise. How so?
Well, we used to kind of assume that wanting that drive, that motivation to go after a reward, and liking the actual pleasure you get from it were essentially two sides of the same coin, driven by the same brain systems.
Yeah, that seems intuitive. You want it because you like it.
Right. But animal studies, especially work looking at the brain chemical dopamine, revealed that they're actually quite separate systems, dissociable.
Yeah.
And that's a game changer for thinking about reward.
Okay, separate systems. So wanting isn't the same as liking in the brain.
Not primarily, no. The surprising insight is that what drives us isn't always the same thing that brings us pleasure.
So we can intensely want something without necessarily liking it all that much, or vice versa. That still feels a bit weird compared to everyday experience.
It does feel counterintuitive. Early ideas, heavily influenced by Roy Wise's dopamine pleasure hypothesis, suggested dopamine was the brain's main pleasure chemical. But Berridge's lab found something different.
What did it find?
They found that if you stimulated dopamine release in rats, it caused a powerful wanting to eat. They'd work really hard for food, but it didn't seem to increase how much they liked the food based on their facial expressions, like licking their lips.
Huh. They wanted it more, but didn't enjoy it more.
Exactly. Subsequent research then mapped out the distinct psychological features of this dopamine-mediated wanting, which is often called incentive salience. It's that motivational pull, that magnetism that makes cues for reward grab your attention and draw you in. Think of dopamine less as the pleasure molecule and more as the motivation or get-up-and-go molecule.
Okay, so dopamine is the wanting. What about the liking then? Where does the actual pleasure feeling come from chemically?
Right. Liking, or hedonic pleasure, seems to be generated by a network of quite small, very specific areas in the brain. They're often called hedonic hotspots.
Hedonic hotspots, okay.
And these hotspots, they respond to different brain chemicals, particularly opioids like endorphins and endocannabinoids, things related to cannabis, but not primarily dopamine.
Interesting. So different chemicals, different locations.
And these liking hotspots were actually quite small and anatomically fragile compared to the much larger, more robust brain circuits that handle the dopamine-driven wanting.
It's fascinating that the pleasure centers are so localized and use different chemicals than the drive system.
It really is. And this whole wanting versus liking distinction first pinned down in animals, has since been confirmed in humans. Pharmacological studies helped here.
How did they test that in people?
Well, for example, studies found that if you give people drugs that block dopamine, it reduces their reported wanting for rewards. Could be drugs for addicts, or even food for regular folks. But it didn't necessarily decrease how much they reported liking those things when they consumed them.
Okay, so less drive, but same enjoyment.
Seems like it. And conversely, giving drugs that increase dopamine didn't reliably boost people's ratings of how much they liked the reward.
That actually makes a lot of sense when you think about something like addiction, doesn't it? Where someone might desperately want a drug, even if they say it doesn't bring them much pleasure anymore.
Precisely. That's a classic example. And there's also dopamine dysregulation syndrome, or DDS, which you sometimes see in Parkinson's patients.
What's that?
Some medications used to treat Parkinson's boost dopamine levels. In a subset of patients, this can lead to really compulsive wanting for things like gambling, shopping, sex, even their medication itself. It becomes an intense craving.
But do they enjoy these things more?
Often, not really. Or the wanting becomes completely out of proportion to any pleasure they get. Patients often describe it as this unbearable urge, this intense want that's disconnected from actual enjoyment. It's a really striking human confirmation of dopamine driving wanting.
Wow. So animal studies really paved the way for understanding this critical difference in humans. Okay, now let's get into those newer human studies you mentioned earlier, by Massaccesi et al. And Korb et al. What were they looking at specifically?
Right, so these studies wanted to dig deeper into the specific roles of dopamine and opioid systems in both wanting and liking in healthy human volunteers. And they looked at both social rewards, like a gentle, pleasant touch, and non-social rewards, like tasty food.
How did they test the dopamine and opioid parts?
They used pharmacological tools.
Yeah.
So they gave participants either imidazolpride, which blocks dopamine receptors, or naltrexone, which blocks opioid receptors, or a placebo. And then they combined this with brain imaging, fMRI, to see what was happening in the brain.
Okay.
And they also used other measures, like looking at subtle facial muscle activity, EMG, which can indicate pleasure, and asking people for subjective ratings of wanting and liking, and measuring how much effort they'd exert for a reward.
A multi-pronged approach. So what were the key results? What did they find?
Okay, so Korb and colleagues in their 2020 study found something interesting with naltrexone, the opioid blocker. When people were consuming rewards, they liked either food or touched the naltrexone, reduced their positive facial reactions.
Like fewer smiles or lip licking.
Exactly. Those subtle facial muscle movements associated with pleasure. This suggests that, yeah, our opioid system is involved in the immediate experienced pleasure, the liking of both social and non-social rewards.
Okay, that fits the animal model.
It does. Interestingly, though, both drugs, the dopamine blocker and the opioid blocker, reduce the amount of effort participants were willing to put in to get the rewards.
So both systems affect motivation, the wanting or drive part?
Seems like it, at least in terms of effort. But here's a twist. In their study, neither drug significantly affected the participants' own ratings of how much they wanted or liked the rewards.
Wait, so their faces showed less pleasure with the opioid blocker, but they didn't report feeling less pleasure.
Correct. Their outward expression changed, but their subjective rating didn't.
Which is fascinating, right? It really underscores how tricky it is to measure these internal states accurately. Maybe the facial expressions are tapping into something more basic.
Yeah, maybe more automatic liking reaction versus a more considered judgment of liking. Huh. What about the other study, Massaccesi et al.? So their 2024 study used a similar setup. They also found no significant effect of either drug on the subjective ratings of wanting or liking, but they saw effects in the brain imaging.
Ah, okay. What did the fMRI show?
Naltrexone, the opioid blocker, affected activity in a brain region called the medial orbitofrontal cortex, or MOFC. Think of the OFC as a kind of value computation center.
Okay.
Naltrexone changed how the MOFC responded when participants were consuming rewards, specifically the difference in response to high versus low rewards. And this happened for both social touch and food.
So opioids are involved in processing reward value in the OFC for different kinds of rewards?
Seems like it. And the dopamine blocker, amisulpride, that impacted activity in key reward circuit areas, the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and the nucleus accumbens, NA, during both anticipation and consumption of rewards.
That fits with dopamine's role in motivation and maybe signaling reward presence.
Exactly. One other finding they noted was that the effects of the drug seemed generally stronger for the food rewards compared to the social touch reward.
Hmm. So maybe while there's overlap, the brain chemistry for social rewards versus non-social rewards isn't exactly the same in humans either.
That's a key implication. The fact that opioid signaling in the MOFC seems important for both types of reward is really interesting, suggests a common pathway for experience, pleasure, or value. But the weaker effects for touch might mean other neurochemical systems are also really important for social rewards.
Like what?
Well, maybe things like oxytocin, often called the love hormone, or serotonin. The researchers themselves suggest that. It's also worth remembering these human studies are complex and maybe more constrained than the animal work, and historically, human research focused a lot more on non-social rewards like food or money.
Right, right. Okay, this brings us back really nicely to that core concept you mentioned, incentive salience. Can you unpack that a bit more? How does that actually drive our motivation day to day?
Sure. So incentive salience, or wanting, it's this specific type of motivation. It's often triggered by cues associated with reward, and it's attention-grabbing. It's
Yeah.
largely orchestrated by those mesocortical limbic brain systems we mentioned in the network, heavily reliant on dopamine.
So it's what makes the cues themselves attractive, like the sight or smell of something good.
Exactly. It's like the dopamine system paints those cues with motivational significance. It makes the smell of coffee or the sight of a notification on your phone suddenly seem incredibly important, desirable, capable of making us act to get the associated reward.
It gives them urgency.
Urgency is a great word for it. Wanting adds that motivational urgency to our more cognitive, conscious desires. It really provides the push, the impetus for action. It's also linked to personality traits, things like impulsivity or sensation seeking.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier it's not fixed, right? It
Yeah.
changes based on our internal state.
Absolutely crucial point. The incentive salience, the wanting triggered by a cue, isn't static. It's constantly modulated by how we're feeling inside. Are we hungry? Are we stressed? Are we maybe intoxicated? All these things can amplify or dampen the wanting elicited by a cue. That's the essence of those Benjer-Totes rules again.
So seeing a picture of pizza might trigger way more wanting if I haven't eaten all day compared to if I just finished a big meal.
Precisely. Your internal state tunes the power of the external cue, and it works the other way too.
How so?
Encountering those cues can actually amplify the motivational power of our internal drives. Sometimes just feeling hungry isn't quite enough to get you off the couch, but then smelling baking bread. That cue can really kick the wanting system into high gear and make that hunger feel much more compelling.
So cues and internal states are in this constant dialogue.
Very much so. And in humans, even just vividly imagining a reward can trigger incentive salience to some extent. But generally, actual real-world cues tend to be more potent. Think about the classic marshmallow experiment with kids.
Right, seeing the marshmallow right there is much harder to resist than just thinking about it.
Exactly. That immediate sensory cue has powerful incentive salience.
It's amazing how these subtle signals can wield such influence over our desires. Now, shifting gears slightly, you mentioned something really intriguing earlier, a surprising link between wanting and fear.
Ah.
How on earth can those be related? They feel like total opposites.
Yeah, this is a truly fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive finding from the research. It turns out that reward wanting, that incentive salience we've been talking about, might have a kind of negative counterpart, sometimes called fearful salience.
Fearful salience.
Right. And despite being psychological opposites, one makes you approach, the other makes you avoid or cope. They seem to share some of the same underlying brain machinery, specifically in the mesolimbic dopamine system and the nucleus accumbens. These systems contribute to making stimuli motivationally salient, making them stand out.
Wait, so the same basic brain system can flag something as go get it and watch out for it? That's
Wow.
pretty wild.
Yeah. That's the really intriguing part. Both incentive salience and fearful salience make their specific triggers, the reward cue or the threat cue, grab our attention, become incredibly meaningful, motivationally speaking. But the outcome is different.
Approach versus avoid.
Exactly. Wanting leads to attraction, approach.
Yeah.
Fearful salience leads to perceiving a threat and engaging in active coping behaviors, maybe avoidance, maybe vigilance. And research in rats has even identified what they call a desire-dread valence keyboard within the nucleus accumbens.
A desire-dread keyboard. Seriously?
Yeah, they found that stimulating different tiny spots within this brain area can reliably trigger either wanting-like behaviors, like eating, or fear-like defensive behaviors, like hitting different keys produces different emotional notes.
That sounds like something straight out of science fiction. A literal switch in the brain between desire and dread.
It almost does, yeah.
Mm.
And what's even more surprising is that the tuning of these little spots, whether they produce desire or dread, isn't necessarily fixed. It can actually be recalibrated by the environment.
How can the environment change that?
Well, for example, studies found that putting a rat in a bright, noisy, maybe stressful environment could cause a brain spot that usually triggers wanting to instead trigger fear responses when stimulated, and vice versa in a calm, comfortable setting.
Whoa. So the context we're in can literally retune how parts of our motivational circuits respond.
That's what it suggests. It really underscores this dynamic, flexible interplay between our brain's internal workings and the world around us. Context massively shapes our motivations and even these fundamental emotional responses.
That's incredible. It really highlights how context isn't just background noise. Okay, what about other negative emotions, like disgust? How does that fit into this picture with fear and wanting?
Right, so disgust is another major negative emotion. It definitely shares some neural overlap with fear, but it also has its own distinct features and likely somewhat separate circuitry as well.
What are the core features of disgust?
Well, there are these core, almost reflexive reactions, especially to bad tastes or smells, think gagging, mouth gapes, head shakes. And in humans, of course, this can get extended to more abstract conceptual things. Moral disgust, feelings of contamination, social rejection.
Right. Does it use the same brain areas as fear?
There's some overlap, but also differences. For instance, studies in rats point to a brain area called the ventral pallidum as being important for taste-related disgust reactions. But there also seems to be some convergence, especially for intense reactions. Some research suggests overlapping neural generators for intense disgust and intense fear might exist in a posterior part of the nucleus accumbens.
The same area as the desire-dread keyboard.
In the general vicinity, yeah. And it seems to involve the activity of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which often acts as an inhibitory or calming signal in the brain. So maybe intense fear and intense disgust share some mechanisms related to strong inhibition or specific patterns of activity in that region.
So distinct emotions, fear and disgust, but maybe sharing some common neural ground, especially when things get really intense.
That seems to be the picture emerging. Research suggests that even quite subtle shifts in the patterns of neural activity within these partly overlapping brain regions could lead to qualitatively different experiences, like adding that component of revulsion to fear.
Wow. This has been an absolutely fascinating, really deep dive into just how complex emotion and motivation are. If we had to sum it up, what are the key insights you want people to take away?
Okay, well, I think firstly, our whole understanding of emotion is clearly still evolving,
Yeah.
right? It's moving beyond thinking it's only about our conscious, subjective feelings.
Right. The unconscious reactions matter too.
Hugely. There's compelling evidence for these unconscious emotional processes that really do significantly impact our behavior, maybe more than we realize. Secondly, that distinction between wanting and liking is just crucial.
Driven by different brain chemicals.
Exactly. Primarily dopamine driving that motivational want, and opioids and endocannabinoids being more involved in the pleasure, the like. Understanding that difference is key for thinking about everyday motivation, but also for things like addiction.
And the third thing,
And thirdly, those surprising connections between seemingly opposite drives, like wanting and fear, sharing some underlying machinery. It just highlights how intricate and sometimes, frankly, paradoxical our brain's motivational circuits really are.
yeah, definitely not simple on-off switches. And it seems really clear that studying animals, despite the caveats about subjective experience, provides incredibly valuable windows into these fundamental processes in humans, too.
Absolutely. Animal models let us investigate the mechanisms, the neurochemistry, the circuits, with a level of detail and control that's often just not possible in human studies. They reveal these fundamental principles that can then guide and inform research back in people.
So here's maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Considering that our wanting and liking can actually pull apart, and that our brains can have these emotional reactions without us even being aware, how might that understanding shift the way you think about your own desires, your fears, and maybe the choices you make every single day? It certainly gives me a lot to chew on.
Indeed. It's complex stuff. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating topics, this deep, complex interplay between our brains, our feelings, and what truly motivates us. There's always more to learn about the surprising forces shaping our inner lives.